I'm Charmaine Fuller. These are kind of what I specialize in. Just did some EMDR training. I'm also trained in EFT and IFS, although not certified in any of those. I do sex therapy, a lot of late diagnosed neurodivergent, so like ADHD and autism that's diagnosed later in life in adulthood, religious trauma, LGBTQIA issues, and non-monogamous relationships. And surprising, all of those things have a whole lot of overlap. So, really what I'm talking about today is religious trauma. Okay, there's a lot of different facets to religious trauma. The three main kind of components of what people are dealing with when they deal with religious trauma are spiritual abuse, abuse by a religious leader, or a faith crisis. So, spiritual abuse. This is really when those religious ideas, the religious fundamentals, the spiritualism is used to control or manipulate another person. So this can absolutely come from a religious leader, but it can be used by anybody, used by parents, by spouses, teachers, anything. But it's when those spiritual ideas are used inappropriately to control or manipulate another person. Okay? Can also happen when a religious leader thinks himself above questioning, right? I'm the authority, don't question me. That's considered spiritual abuse. Don't see a whole lot of this, some of this definitely, some of this in therapy. I've actually never seen this personally in therapy, but this is definitely a widespread problem, as we know, and we see over and over again in the news. Abuse from religious leaders. This is usually in the form of childhood sexual abuse, so CSA. This is sexual grooming, rape, molesting, those kinds of things. It can come from religious or spiritual leaders, from camp counselors, from staff or volunteers at church. It can also come from outside the institution when a predator uses religious rhetoric. So this is slightly different from spiritual abuse in that it is something that can be litigated against, right? Somebody is going to pay a price for this type of perpetration. Religious influence constitutes one of the most understudied cultural issues in child sexual abuse today. So definitely an issue, not something that I personally see a whole lot though in therapy. What I see the most of, and what we get here at Arizona Relationship Institute, is a whole lot of people who have experienced a faith crisis. This is either they are in the middle of a faith crisis, they have experienced a faith crisis and decided to leave their religion, or occasionally they've experienced a faith crisis and have decided to stay in their religion. But this is what we see most often. It's often referred to as the dark night of the soul, which you can imagine that kind of imagery, what that feels like for a person experiencing that. That was coined by a 16th century, I don't know, he must have been like a monk or something, St. John of the Cross back in the 16th century. What we see along with a faith crisis is a lot of depression, anxiety, existential dread, even suicidal ideation. So during the beginning stages of a faith crisis, people often turn to their family members, their friends within the faith, scripture, prayer, writings of leaders within the faith, and or their local religious leaders. What you hear often is people talking about the shelf. I have something that I have a question about, I'm going to put it on the shelf to get answered later. Or sometimes it's even, you know what, when I die, I'm going to ask God about this. The shelf. That's a question or a term you hear a lot of. When you put too many things on a shelf, what happens though to a shelf? It breaks. So something you hear often is my shelf broke. That cognitive dissonance was too much and I had to start to address some of these things. When a faith crisis continues past a shelf breaking, a person often turns to secular help. That's where we as therapists come in. So science, psychology, and of course therapy. This is where we're going to start looking at identity development, at radical self-acceptance, incorporating some mindfulness, compassion, and loving kindness, and a whole lot of reclaiming those rituals, those symbols, and that mythology from a previous religion. So, like I said earlier, religious and spiritual struggles are associated with depressive and anxiety symptoms and psychological strain. This is studied over and over again, right? In high cost or high demand religions, so a high cost or a high demand religion are those that are more distinctive in diet, in dress, in speech. They're ones where if a person deviates from the norm, they will often be shunned. So that's what I see a lot of, people leaving very fundamental religions, evangelical, Pentecostal, and even occasionally I have treated former members of cults. So those more high cost or high demand religions, those symptoms of anxiety, depression, etc., they're going to be a whole lot worse. So one thing to really understand with anybody who is experiencing any kind of religious trauma is to understand the ways that the religion has really informed their sense of self and their identity. So it's so important for a therapist to be able to understand the tenets of the religion that they're coming from. It's not essential, but it's certainly helpful, because more painful than the doubt itself is the feeling that one has been spiritually deceived, manipulated, exploited, or even abandoned by their religion or by their faith, right? All of these things are also tied together. Sue Monk Kidd was a author who wrote religiously, and then she wrote a book called Dance of the Dissident Daughter that talked about her leaving her very fundamental, I think she was Southern Baptist. Could be wrong about that.
What was it?
Dance of the Dissident Daughter. It's a brilliant book. I've been reading it for 8 years. Because every time I pick it up, there's like so much good stuff in it that I'm like, oh my gosh, this is brilliant. And then I'm like, I got to put it aside for a little while. So 8 years I've been reading that book. Okay, so she says, betrayal of any kind is hard, but betrayal by one's religion is excruciating. Many people who are leaving high-cost religions are facing a loss of community, a loss of support, a loss of identity, and sometimes even in extreme cases, a loss of family. And so we as therapists are doing so much to process all of this. There's so many different components. And like I said at the beginning, all of the different ways that I treat people and the different specialties I see, there is a lot of overlap. There's a lot of people who are questioning their sexuality or questioning their gender identity as a part of coming out of a very fundamental religion. Okay, so this loss of self, again, this is what I'm seeing most often with people who are experiencing religious trauma. Those strict rules and guidelines for living really lead a person to alter their core parts of themselves. And they're usually not even aware of that, right? They're trying to fit within the context that the religion tells them who and what they're supposed to be, right? Those gender roles. One thing that I often heard growing up was that being a mother was going to be the most fulfilling thing I ever did in my life. It really wasn't for me. Being a mother was really, really hard. And while I love my children, I'm obsessed with them, I think they're amazing, I have received fulfillment in so many other ways. And so that was one of my things in leaving religion, was really coming out of those traditional gender roles. Sexuality, gender identity, whether or not you even identify in this very binary way that oftentimes religion is perpetuating. Some of the associated psychological issues that we see a lot with people experiencing religious trauma or faith crisis are these internalized things, right? This internalized homophobia. I'm bad, I'm wrong, I'm sick, I'm disgusting because I'm attracted to people of my same gender. Or I'm not really friends with women. I don't like women. Women are not nice to each other, and I'm not like other women. That's all internalized misogyny, right? And really working out those things so that somebody can engage in radical self-acceptance. Whom what I am is amazing. Whom what I am is perfect. Whom what I am deserves to be celebrated. Okay, compulsory heterosexuality. This is a lot of times too what we see, where I'll get a person in my office who are like, maybe I'm asexual. I don't really care about sex. I don't care about relationships. I'm like, hey, okay, that might be the case. And I'm here to celebrate that. And also tell me about your relationships. Well, I've only ever been with, 2 guys and my marriage isn't great. And I'm like, all right, have you ever considered you might not be straight? I don't know. Okay, well, let me tell you about compulsory heterosexuality. Because what we're most often seeing, especially for people of a certain age who grew up in the 80s and 90s and all we saw was heterosexuality, there may not even be the language there to label or define, right? And so sometimes it's just a matter of teaching them, hey, this is what exists outside, and go make some mistakes and figure it out, because that's how you're going to figure out who and what you are. So also, again, a part of this internalized issue are the judgments about the self and others in living in those non-traditional ways. So tattoos, that's a thing I see often among people who have a lot of judgments about tattoos for themselves or for their partner, for other people in their family. Non-monogamy, surprisingly, when people leave very fundamental religions, they want to go and try other things. Even when they're married, they're like, I've never been with anybody else. I've never even dated. I don't know what this is. And so a lot of times it's addressing issues related to non-monogamy. Even sex outside of a marriage, whether it's pre or post-marital, so not necessarily non-monogamy, kink, all of those types of things. So again, sex therapy plays a lot into all of this. And that's basically a rundown of what we're looking at when people experience or come to us for treatment for religious trauma. Any questions?
So just so I understand, compulsory heterosexuality, that's just like the natural, like this is what is normalized or whatever?
Yes.
So I'm going to go with this?
Right.
I haven't considered the
right.
other? Okay.
Right. It's when your whole entire life, all you've seen portrayed is heterosexuality, right? All of the stories I grew up hearing, all of the Disney princesses I saw, every rom-com I saw, every TV show had a mom and a dad, whether or not they were married or divorced or whatever, but it was always mom, dad, right? My parents are heterosexual. My grandparents are heterosexual. All of my aunts and uncles are heterosexual, right? And so you grow up thinking that's the only thing that exists. Okay, there's a great NPR story about the development of color linguistically that really, I think, portrays this idea. Okay, so this guy is reading Homer's The Odyssey, right? And he says, oh, Homer describes things weirdly, okay? I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, the wine dark sea. That's how Homer describes the ocean, right? And this guy's like, that's weird, the wine dark sea. The ocean is like blue, maybe green, but like this is strange. So he looks at all of Homer's works and starts to tally up the number of times he uses different color words and discovers Homer does not use the color blue, okay? Looks at Homer's contemporaries. The color blue does not exist linguistically, okay, at that time. So broadens his search again and starts looking at different languages and how they develop color, and he finds a pattern. Black and white are the first two color distinctions that exist linguistically, and then red, pretty much every single language, and pretty much every single language, blue is last, and the middle ones get mixed up. There's one exception, and that's, I think, Egyptian, where blue comes earlier. But the idea is generally that red exists in abundance in nature, and it's very easy to recreate. Like you think of cave drawings, they're all in shades of like red and rust and orange, whereas blue is actually a chemical process to recreate, so it's a color that's difficult to recreate, and it doesn't exist as abundantly in nature. Okay, we're all following me? Mm-hmm. Okay, so you say, but what about the sky, right? Because the sky is everywhere. Everyone sees the sky, and that's blue, so it exists everywhere. Ha, 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 ha. And this is where you would be wrong. Because when they look at the way that the sky is described linguistically before the color blue exists, what they see is that the sky itself is not usually described, but it's rather things in the sky that are described, okay? So this guy who's doing all this research, he's like, cool, I'm gonna try this out. I've got a new little baby. Nicoletta, maybe you want to try this with your baby. Let's see if we can recreate it. Okay, I've got a new little baby, and he tells his wife, as you're teaching the baby colors, don't ever teach the baby that the sky is blue. Okay? We'll teach him blue, we'll teach him green, we'll teach him all the colors, but don't ever teach her that the sky itself is blue. Okay? So they're out on one of their walks, and they say, this man says to his daughter, hey, point out something green. Okay? What color is that flower? What color is that tree? Oh, what color is that dog? And then he points to the sky and he says, what color is that? And she looks at him like he is a crazy person. Blank stare, doesn't have an answer. Okay? As time goes on, they're playing the game more. And for a while, there's no answer. She doesn't have an answer. She's confused by it until eventually she says white. The sky is white. Okay? That answer sticks around for a little while, and eventually she says, oh, it's blue. And then it switches back and forth between white and blue a little bit until eventually it just is blue. And then it's, forever blue. Okay, so all of this to illustrate that there is a thought out there that unless we have the language to describe the sky does not actually exist. It is a void to us, right? And so that is what compulsory heterosexuality is. If I don't have the language to understand something outside of heterosexuality, if I don't have an example there, I don't actually know it exists. It is a void for me, okay? This is why representation matters. Because unless we have the language and the example out there, we don't know any different. It is a void to us. Cool, huh? It's an NPR story. You can look it up. Such a good question. Did that answer it?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Any other questions?
Well, give us an example as to if you had a couple come in where one is still active in the faith,
Right.
and the other is questioning or struggling.
Yeah.
How would you approach that?
So what I generally start with is a lot of what Linnell talked about is coming back to those communication skills, right? How do I validate my partner in a way that does not invalidate myself, right? And that can be a thing that will be really difficult. So it's a lot of those really, really basic communication skills is how I start with. And my approach, very similar to Linnell's, but I use what is called the communication garden. There are 3 poisons and 3 or 4 fertilizers, right? Our 3 poisons: mind reading, intent assigning, tone policing. I know what you really mean is, don't do that. That's not helpful for anybody. I know you're only doing this thing because. No, you don't. You're not a mind reader. Not your job. And tone policing, I know you said you're fine, but it doesn't sound like it, so I'm not going to believe you. Don't do that. Not my job to read your mind or to interpret your words. My job is to believe you with what you say, okay? Our 3 fertilizers: radical honesty, okay? Radical honesty is your classic I statements. I think, I feel. It's also I heard, I remember, because just like Linnell pointed out, you come out with your partner with well, you did this and you said this. What is your partner immediately going to say? No, I didn't. No, I didn't. I did not do that or say that, right? Big T truth does not exist. All memories are all made up. Study after study shows this. So what we want is not big T truth. It doesn't exist. It's not important. What is important is what I have retained, okay? So radical honesty in the context of a mixed faith marriage is, this is what I believe, and it's really important to me. And I'm going to also honor what you believe, because I recognize that's really important to you, right? This is magical for me. That's magical for you. Isn't that cool that human beings exist in different ways? Very difficult to do, especially if it's not something you have ever practiced or done before. And so in session, this is what we're doing. We're doing a lot of that practicing. So our fertilizers: radical honesty, the ability to be concise, because human beings check out. Our brains just are not wired for listening to long periods of time. So we want to be concise. A meme, the word meme. Does anybody know the history of the word meme? Ha ha ha. Developed in the 70s, pre-internet, thank you very much, by Richard Dawkins to refer to genetic encoding. A meme is a small bit of information that spreads rapidly. Yeah. So in our conversations with each other, we want to have short bits of information so that our partner can, what was the V in love? Validate. Yes, perfect. I wanted you to speak up. I was just like, if nobody's going to speak up, I'm just going to talk right through it. Okay, but the V is validate, right? And that's what we want. And our third fertilizer is validation, or at the very least being able to repeat, right? Because sometimes we can't validate, we don't really understand, we haven't read the book. The book I love for validation is called I Don't Have to Make Everything All Better. It's a book I think like literally everybody should read. But hi, welcome, come in. Hi. You're fine, please. So, validation. And that's what you believe, what you have to say, what you are doing is important, just like what I believe and what I'm doing and what I have to say is also important. So, such a good question. Mixed faith marriages. I always start at the basics, which is those communication skills. And it's difficult. It's really difficult. Like, I don't want to be like, hey, it's really easy. I just taught you how to have good communication. No. Okay.
Yay.
Thank you.